There is no doubt that 2019 was a very strong year for film. There were so many great movies released that year, and you can view my list of my top 10 favorite films of 2019 in the link down below. But just like life, there's good and there's also bad. And so now it's time for me to break down my list of the 10 worst movies I saw in 2019. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that the films were all bad from a technical or creative standpoint. Not all of them, but they were just my least favorite movies in that they personally did not resonate with me. Some I feel more strongly than others, but we will discuss. I have to say, I'm a bit nervous to tell you my list of my 10 least favorite movies of 2019 because as I was sorting through it, through my list, there are quite a number of popular movies on here that many people have loved. Some movies, in fact, that the majority of fans and critics have loved. But we're all different, and I respect those that share different opinions than mine, and hopefully I won't make a few cinemaphile enemies after this video. Again, this is just my humble opinion. And so here we go. We're gonna kick this off with my number 10 spot, working my way up to my number 1 least favorite. But in my number 10 spot, we have Aleta, Battle Angel. Now, this movie wasn't bad, per se. The effects were pretty good, and I appreciated the setup for a potential franchise, but that was the greatest weakness for the film. It was all set up with little payoff. It planned too far in the future for multiple films and didn't dwell enough in the present to give us a complete and solid first film. And honestly, I almost forgot about this movie altogether, and some of that can be attributed to the lackluster and incomplete execution of the film. Promising premise, but not enough to chew on. And in my number 9 spot, we have Aladdin. Now, there are some movies that get better with age, and some that get worse with age, and Aladdin was sadly an example of the latter. This movie already had problems with my first viewing where I had casting issues with Aladdin and Jafar. There were narrative issues that muddled the overall flow of the story and issues with how often the overall look of the film, how cheap it felt, honestly. There were so many moments where the cinematography, how they shot, the set designs, I don't know, it just looked cheap. It didn't look rich enough for this world. Sure, there were some definitive high points, such as Jasmine and Genie, but the overall issues only magnified dramatically with a second viewing and only made the experience more disappointing for me in the end. In my number 8 spot, get ready, we have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now, for the record, I view Quentin Tarantino films like I view whiskey. I don't like it. It's not my taste. It never sits well with me, but I know it's also an acquired taste and many people love it. And that's just fine. I think he's a brilliant filmmaker and all of his actors do an amazing job in every film, but his style of filmmaking just isn't for me. And I've seen several of his movies and not one of them has managed to win me over. I love moments, but it doesn't work for me in the end, sadly to say. This movie especially felt very slow, it felt very bloated, and it lacked a clear narrative and was more or less a series of vignettes. Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt did some amazing work, but this film just didn't impress me overall. And I know a lot of this is personal preference in terms of directing style, personally for me. In my number 7 spot, we have Rocketman. Now, I feel that there is such a divide between fans who loved Bohemian Rhapsody and fans who loved Rocketman. For me, Rocketman focused a lot more on the melodrama and personal struggles of Elton John in a way that made it feel way more like a dark biopic rather than a fantastical, energetic musical as it marketed itself to be. And this choice only brought the movie's overall energy way down. And on top of that, they don't even go into the best part of Elton John's life and his later years and all the wonderful things he achieved, which to me is way more interesting. The pacing for this movie was off, and even though Taron Egerton did a great job in his role, this movie simply lacked the electricity and rush that I experienced while watching Bohemian Rhapsody, which made me love that film. And in my number 6 spot, we have A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And I gotta say, this movie felt like a chore to sit through. And a lot of it is because I did not connect at all with the male lead played by Matthew Rhys. And it's really his film. It's not Mr. Rogers' film. Yes, Tom Hanks is a supporting significant role, but it's all about Matthew Rhys' character. There was very little energy or spark to this film, much like the role played by Matthew Rhys. And there was no energy in his performance, no charisma, nothing to make me connect with him. And the only redeeming quality that brought any sort of life to this movie is Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers. Besides him, this film is tonally flat, uninspired, and moved so slowly for me. And there are many that loved this movie, and it's probably because they were probably able to connect with our main lead, which sadly I did not. Tom Hanks gave an award-winning performance ultimately, and I only wish it was his film. But sadly, it's not his film, and that was the movie's greatest mistake and weakness, in my opinion. All right, we are reaching the top 5 now, and in the number 5 spot of one of my least favorite movies of the year, we have Dark Phoenix. Now, I've already made a review for this film, and it's just more and more sad to think about how much this movie really missed the mark. And even more sad that X-Men: The Last Stand is a better movie than this one. And even that one is a shitty Dark Phoenix movie too. This movie was so inconsistent, characters all over the place, narrative choices made that did a major disservice to key characters, and even though I thought Sophie Turner did a great job with what she was given, it just makes me that much more disappointed that we couldn't get a better film with such an amazing cast and such an amazing story to use. It's such a tragic missed opportunity and a boner killer of an ending to an almost 20-year franchise. In my number 4 spot, we have Isn't It Romantic? Now, this was just a perfect example of uninspired romantic comedies these days, even with a solid premise and a good cast to back it up. This movie had a couple good laughs, but fell flat due to cheesy dialogue, predictable narrative tropes that were unredeemable in my eyes, and honestly, the rest of the humor just fell flat, and it just got lazier and lazier towards the end. You have a premise that was set up to make fun of itself. Very easy to do, and yet it just became the movie it set out to make fun of, and the joke was ultimately on them. And in my number 3 spot, we have Ad Astra, another controversial choice. Now, this movie just baffled me as to why people thought it was so amazing. Brad Pitt was fine, but his character remains relatively dull and unenthused throughout the entire film. There are narrative happenings that feel entirely left field, with little to no explanation. There are characters played by A-list actors that make cameo appearances with little to no reason for being there. And this movie completely fumbled the overall twist and left me asking what the point of this movie even was. The only redeeming thing about the movie for me was the visuals and the effects, but the rest of it just left me baffled. And in my number 2 spot, we have Jexy. Now, this movie started promisingly for me, and I found a lot of the jokes really funny in the first half, or first third, but then it completely fumbles at the halfway point and spiraled into cable television movie territory for me. And by the end, it lost all its cleverness. It settled for predictable, lazy, and it was very lackluster and almost makes it entirely forgettable at this point. And finally, in my number 1 spot, to me, my least favorite movie and worst movie I have seen all year in 2019 is The Hustle. Now, I'm so mad at how bad this movie is because there is no reason for this movie to be as disappointing as it really is. I loved the trailer, I loved the cast, I loved the premise and the source material it's inspired from, but you've seen literally all the best moments in the trailer because the rest is just bland. And by the end, it's such an eye roll of a final act that just felt insulting to me. The movie could have been so fresh, it could have been fun, clever, quick, and you have 2 very different leads that play well off of each other. But the writing was so uninspired, and it lost all life for the majority of the movie. The only redeeming parts were the scenes we already saw in the trailer. So if you want to enjoy this movie, just watch the trailer, because that's all the fun that this movie has to offer, and the rest is just nothing but a pile portrayal of cruelly wasted opportunity. Anne Hathaway especially deserves better than this. And there you have it, everyone. Those are my 10 least favorite movies of 2019. I know that it's a very, very diverse, controversial list, but whatever, everyone is entitled to their opinion. I'd be curious to hear what your least favorite movies of 2019 were. Feel free to list them down below. Thank you all again for tuning in. And until next time, I am Ryan Boehme signing off. Bye, everyone.